he is adorable. He is cute as a button. He has a Mona Lisa smile. He never stops talking. You know, everyone thought that he was charismatic and intellectual. And I mean, even Goethe calls him a fountain with many pipes. And Gallatin says he talks in a combination of French, German, Spanish, and English all at once. And I've learned more in 2 hours than I have in the last 2 years. My name's Eleanor Harvey, and I'm the senior curator at the Smithsonian American Art Museum in Washington, D.C. I'm also the curator of the exhibition Alexander von Humboldt and the United States, Art, Nature, and Culture. And those are the galleries that you see behind me. It's a pleasure to be once again involved with one of the Vermont Humanities Council's conferences, and no better subject than Humboldt and American democracy for a time like this. What I'd like to do is to get us started by taking us into an understanding of who Humboldt is and why you should care. Alexander von Humboldt was one of the most widely recognized human beings alive on the planet during the 19th century. He traveled over 40,000 miles through 40 countries on 4 continents. He lived until his 89th year, wrote 36 books and over 25,000 letters. He slept maybe 4 hours a night and called coffee concentrated sunbeams. He can't stop thinking about what it is that he needs to know in order to postulate this theory that everything on the globe is interconnected: people, ecosystems, weather, climate. It's a radical theory then. It is one we pretty much take for granted today. So if you want to know more about Humboldt himself as a human being, we are very fortunate to have Andrea Wolf's prize-winning book, The Invention of Nature, Alexander von Humboldt's New World, to rely on. It's an amazing and engaging book. If you haven't read it already, I would highly recommend it. It's really an opportunity to understand how this man's endless, restless curiosity creates a different vision of the world in which we live. It is Humboldt's book, Cosmos, that puts him on the map and makes him an international celebrity. You're familiar with this name because Carl Sagan in the 1970s created a TV series, Cosmos, based on Humboldt. Neil deGrasse Tyson and Ann Druyan, Carl Sagan's widow, have done the reboot of Cosmos. But it's the idea that everything from the outer atmosphere down to the molecular level is in some way interconnected. So what does this have to do with us and with American democracy? Well, interestingly enough, Humboldt got permission to spend 4 years in the South American colonies owned by the Kingdom of Spain. And so between 1799 and 1804, Humboldt is touring modern-day Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, and spends a year in Mexico, during which time he learns about the Louisiana Purchase, and he realizes that he's so close, he would really like to pay a visit to the 3rd president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson. But first he has to get there. And what he's going to do is to bring with him that notion of an excitement about how natural history is a way of learning about ourselves. And the gentleman you see in the painting on the right, Charles Wilson Peale, the artist in his museum, will be his escort through Philadelphia when Humboldt arrives in May of 1804. But as I said, the reason for Humboldt's visit is that he really wants to meet Jefferson. And the reason he wants to meet him is Humboldt has grown up in Imperial Europe. He is he's born in Prussia, where there is the king there. He will be raised watching Napoleon rise to power. He will find himself thwarted in his ability to travel by internecine warfare with Spain, Portugal, England, France, and Prussia. And he really hopes that American democracy will be a bellwether for how the world can adopt a better organizing mechanism. So when he gets here, he's not really convinced that as a young naturalist, that the third president of the United States is going to make time for him. So he writes a letter of introduction, a snippet of which you see on this slide. He then flatters Jefferson by saying he has such a high admiration for his writings, meaning the Declaration of Independence, his actions as President of the United States, the liberalism of your ideas which have inspired me from my earliest youth. Humboldt has read Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia. He understands Jefferson's concerns for finding America's voice on the international stage. And he really hopes that the ideals of all men are created equal will play out in American democracy. And so when he's in Philadelphia and Charles Willson Peale is taking him around, the first obligatory stop is Peale's museum. And I want you to look at the detail on the left, and you will notice that what Peale has done is combined art, natural history, and politics together to create a museum that is, in effect, a civics lesson. And that is George Washington, positioned strategically and not accidentally above the case that contains the stuffed bald eagle. Those of you who are devotees of the colonial period will also recognize poor Ben Franklin's turkey awaiting taxidermy in the foreground, having not been named America's national bird. But the point is, all of Peale's visitors are understanding that this is their nonverbal classroom in which to absorb American precepts, to take pride in our natural features, to venerate our military and scientific and political leaders, and to use this as a lifelong educational program. By the time Humboldt leaves, Charles Willson Peale will have painted this portrait of him and included it along with George Washington's, along with Lewis and Clark, up in that panoply. In effect, we have adopted him as one of our own. So why? Why would we want to adopt Humboldt? Well, again, one of the things that Humboldt is really after is functioning on democracy. Humboldt and Napoleon, whom you see here, are born in the same year, and that's about the only similarity that they maintain. Napoleon's military ventures impede Humboldt's research travels. It blocks him from Italy. It blocks him from Egypt. The bad blood between Napoleon and the leaders of Prussia, England, Spain, and Portugal mean that it's tough for Humboldt to physically get around. Napoleon is also, like any good imperial monarch, insecure. And so as Humboldt's star rises, Napoleon chafes. He censors and intercepts Humboldt's mail. He ignores him at ceremonies. He belittles him. He tries to kick him out of the country as a spy. And if you put their lives in parallel, it becomes a really interesting commentary on why Humboldt's politics trend toward liberalism and democracy in a direct confrontation against Napoleonic values. It's the freedom of expression, freedom of the press, freedom of movement that Humboldt so desperately desires. So it must not be too surprising to find that Humboldt and Jefferson will become good friends. And in fact, that friendship will last the rest of Jefferson's life. They will continue to correspond through 1826. Humboldt has never met a ruler who treats him as an equal until he meets Jefferson. Jefferson gives him free access to the president's house all day and night. They exchange information freely, and Humboldt expresses his fervent desire that we will find ways to live up to the ideals expressed in the Declaration of Independence. It's important also that even during this visit, Humboldt is gently pushing on the fact that he also believes that we owe it to those ideals to abolish slavery and to create honorable treaties with our indigenous citizens in order for us to live up to the full measure of all men being created equal. He's not really willing to tackle that head on with Jefferson. He really doesn't want to jeopardize the friendship, so he picks proxies. And it's Albert Gallatin, the Secretary of the Treasury, in whom Humboldt will confide when it comes to population statistics and advocacy for American Indians. And it is William Thornton, the architect of the Capitol, who will be the one who gets the letters about American slavery. In one letter, Humboldt writes to him and says, "The abominable law that permits the importation of Negroes to South Carolina is a disgrace for a state in which I know many level-headed people to live. Conforming to the only course of action dictated by humanity, undoubtedly less cotton will be exported at first. But alas, how I detest this politics that measures and evaluates the public welfare simply according to the value of its exports. The wealth of nations is like the wealth of individuals. It is only secondary to our independence. Before one is free, one must be just. And without justice, there is no lasting prosperity." It is that kind of full-throated expression that Humboldt is more than willing to aim at collateral targets, hoping that the message will get to Jefferson, ever hoping that it means American policy will change. So what does Humboldt bring to the table other than a humanitarian's interest in equality and a naturalist's interest in curiosity and science? He brings a map. Humboldt, as I said, had heard about the Louisiana Purchase while he was in Mexico. And you see a map here of the United States around 1800 showing Texas, Louisiana, and the further west Spanish possessions. The map you see on the left is Humboldt's map of all of the Mexican intendencias up into Texas, over to the Southwest, and down Baja California. It is more detailed than anything Jefferson and Gallatin had access to. When they sent Lewis and Clark out west, just before Humboldt arrives here, it is with a map that is functionally blank in most of those areas, hoping that they will fill in the blanks. Humboldt, on the other hand, full well knows from being in Mexico that the King of Spain is livid that Napoleon sold Louisiana to the United States and not back to the Spanish Empire. And as a result, he's in no mood for pleasant negotiations. The contested border between the US and Spain is the subject of intense diplomatic negotiations, and Jefferson is scrambling to find information about what's the topography, what can you grow there, are there mineral exports, what kind of people live in this region? And Humboldt arrives with a lot of the answers. He is willing to share that map with us, even though he has traveled through South America and Mexico on a Spanish passport. Two reasons for this. The first is Humboldt believes in the free transmission of information. He believes that all knowledge should be shared among everyone. And he knows he's going to publish the map. He's just going to give us a 6-year head start on the information. But he also wants democracy to succeed. And as a result, he is willing to give us this map as a way of leveling the playing field between Spain and the United States. Needless to say, by the time Humboldt leaves, we are over the moon with this man. You can see that Thomas Jefferson will call him an ornament of our age. Dolly Madison will call him the most interesting traveler we have met, and hopes and expresses in a letter that Humboldt will either stay in the United States and become American, or at very least come back and live out the rest of his days here. Before Humboldt leaves, Jefferson shows him a newspaper in which he is being excoriated in the press. And Humboldt is both horrified but gratified when Jefferson says, "No, we're not going to lock up the journalist who wrote this. That's what freedom of the press is all about." Humboldt deeply admires the fact that we are willing to have that kind of free form and open discourse. The other thing that Jefferson does is he sends a letter back with Humboldt to be delivered to the Marquis de Lafayette. Now, Lafayette is also not on Napoleon's list of his favorite human beings, and so Lafayette's mail is also being intercepted and censored. This letter is going to get to Lafayette unimpeded by Napoleon, and in it, Jefferson will introduce Humboldt to the Marquis, forging another friendship that will last the rest of Lafayette's life, but it will also set up the politics of transmitting information back and forth between Paris and the United States. These two pro-American radicals, Humboldt and Lafayette, are joined by a third, Simon Bolivar, who will credit Humboldt with inspiring him to return home to his native South America to free Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Colombia and Peru from Spanish colonial rule. The three of them will become far more liberal as time goes on, very anti-monarchical. By the time of the 1848 revolutions, Humboldt will be in the streets with the young rebels in his hometown of Berlin. So the three of them end up winning Napoleon's undying enmity when they decide to skip his self-coronation shortly after Humboldt's return. Humboldt finds that Napoleon is furious, but it does not stop his involvement with American politics. And in fact, in 1814, during the Treaty of Ghent negotiations, which you see in the upper lozenge, there's John Quincy Adams right in the middle in the brown suit, meeting with the British in order to settle the War of 1812. It is Humboldt in the lower corner who gets himself assigned to the Prussian delegation to argue on behalf of the Americans. Who are the Americans? Well, as I said, it's John Quincy Adams in the upper lozenge. On the far left, a young Henry Clay, and at the bottom, our friend Gallatin, former Secretary of the Treasury and now one of Humboldt's closest friends. John Quincy Adams will follow Humboldt back to Paris. The two men will sit side by side at the French Academy, listening to scientific lectures, going to the salons in the evening, having dinners together, and forging another friendship that deepens the ties between the United States and Humboldt, who is now one of this country's strongest advocates. This is the way that it sort of ushers in an era where Humboldt is a magnet for travelers, American travelers abroad. And in 1837, Humboldt will famously write in a letter to Clemens von Metternich, introducing a fellow American, "I am practically an American myself." Humboldt believed that he could claim the status of being half an American, Lafayette being a full American, because he so admires American democratic principles. The half that he holds back will have to do with the fact that we will drag our feet on the abolition of slavery, but he never gives up on us. And that is one of the things that keeps Humboldt relevant in American politics and a gadfly for American democracy for the entire first half of the 19th century. That commitment to American ideals, and here you see Metternich and Napoleon down there, has to do with the way that it takes root in American exploration and the study and appreciation of nature. I mentioned that Lewis and Clark, whom you see here on the left-hand side, had just left St. Louis when Humboldt arrived in Philadelphia. And there's a moment where Humboldt wants to take off after them because he thinks his instruments are better than theirs, and he worries that their measurements won't be very good. But of course, they've stepped off the edge of the known earth when they left St. Louis to go up the Missouri River, and it's not really clear Humboldt could have found them. But Lewis and Clark represent what Humboldt means when he says, this country that stretches to the west of these mountains, in this case, what you see here, the Blue Ridge or the Appalachian chain, presents a vast area to conquer for science. What the United States brings in value to the international community right now will be the scientific wisdom brought back from successive expeditions and the fact that we will wrap our cultural identity bound up in the monuments we find in nature. One of Humboldt's immediate legacies is every expedition after Lewis and Clark will take an artist along. First, it will be a visual artist. Soon, it will be a photographer. This is Titian Ramsey Peale, Charles Wilson Peale's youngest son, who was 8 years old when Humboldt came through town. The Western Engineer, the ship that Stephen Harriman Long took to the Rocky Mountains in 1819, carrying with them, also for the first time, an entire shelf of Humboldt's published writings as part of their field guides. When Humboldt is in Paris at this time, he gets a copy of the long expedition report and he shares it with the American James Fenimore Cooper, whom you see here. The backdrop is Thomas Cole's painting of The Last of the Mohicans, based on Cooper's work. But as Cooper and Humboldt are comparing notes on the long expedition, Cooper is writing the book The Prairie, which culminates in that notion of how nature functions on a literal and metaphorical level as a way of understanding American democracy. Cooper is joined by his friend Washington Irving, whom you see here in the lower right. And in Paris, Irving and Humboldt will pore over maps in an effort to answer the question how the Americas got the name America instead of Columbia. And this is the Waldseemüller map of 1507, which is the first that terms the American hemisphere as America. Humboldt's influence on Irving will be to inspire him to go west when he returns from Paris, writing A Tour of the Prairie and the Bonneville novels. And together, Cooper and Irving will establish a literary genre in which nature conveys America's moral character. That will become really important, again, for an understanding of those democratic values. Maps are really important too, because maps will tell you a great deal about how a country perceives itself. This is Henry Tanner's map from 1825, signaling the growing symbolic weight of the American West. It incorporates all of the features and the nomenclature that Humboldt had included in the map that he left here with us. But I want you to focus on the cartouche in the lower left-hand corner, because that cartouche tells you what that map is really about. And if you look closely at it, it is Natural Bridge in Virginia in the foreground. And in the background, it is Niagara Falls, 800 miles to the north in upstate New York. By eliding those two features, as though it is the Niagara River running underneath Natural Bridge, what the map maker has done is affirmed that this is the symbol of how to think about the United States. There's Jefferson's moose, there's a bald eagle, there's a beaver. It's all about the symbolic things that separate America from the rest of the world. Humboldt will also say that nature and art are united in his work. And in fact, it'll be Frederick Church who painted these two works of Natural Bridge and Niagara Falls, who will be the artist most deeply inspired by Humboldt of America's landscape painters. It's that perfect blending of art and science and the beginnings of the Hudson River School Association of landscape and American patriotism and democracy. We set aside these landmarks as emblems of our cultural ambitions. And with every expedition west, that landscape expands to include Yellowstone, Yosemite, and the Grand Canyon. So not really surprisingly, there's also a collateral influence in the work of Emerson on the left and Thoreau on the right. For Emerson, it will be the way of absorbing Humboldt and to see it how he inflects Emerson's own view of nature. He describes Humboldt as having an extended center, expanded wings, who marches like an army, gathering all things as he goes, how he reaches from science to science, from law to law, tucking away moons and asteroids and solar systems in the clauses and parentheses of his encyclopedic paragraphs. Thoreau will go the other direction, and instead of looking upward and outward as cosmos, will train that telescope as a microscope on Walden Pond and catalog every detailed feature the same way that Humboldt is trying to catalog every feature around the world. It doesn't really end there. The literary impact will also extend to Walt Whitman, who will write part of Leaves of Grass with a copy of Humboldt's Cosmos on his desk. And when Whitman refers to himself as a cosmos, he is riffing on Humboldt, personalizing and internalizing and distilling that sense of the unity of nature, the unity of human beings, and the sense of being part and parcel of that world existence. There's a really wonderful book that kind of encapsulates all of this that was really important to me as I developed my project on Humboldt, and that is Laura Dassau-Wall's book, The Passage to Cosmos, Alexander von Humboldt and the Shaping of America. If you haven't had a chance to read it yet, this is also, I think, one that I would highly recommend to you. This will culminate in some way in the way that we think about the Western landscape as well. And in 1903, Humboldt's two fervent fans, Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir, will have an epic camping trip in Yosemite in 1903 in order to try to protect the landscape at Yosemite, but to also trade insights on what we can learn from Humboldt. And it's this notion that will give you the basis of what will become the National Park System. The Humboldt Current by Aaron Sachs, looking at 19th century exploration and the roots of American environmentalism, is another book I think that you would all enjoy in order to understand the pervasive, saturating impact of Humboldt's ideas on the way we think about our relationship to the environment, which I find dovetailing right back into the fine arts and into politics. But Humboldt's concerns stretch beyond landscape as a symbol of democracy. He's fundamentally a humanitarian who believes that the way we treat people is the true test of American democracy. The unity of nature is the unity of species. And he's considered the father of modern Mexican archaeology. When he goes to Mexico City in 1804, he is able to study this, the Mexican calendar stone, good 6-7 feet tall, and declare that this is the evidence that pre-Columbian civilizations were once very sophisticated, but beaten down by colonialism and imperial rule as a way of understanding the need, again, for democracy as the thing that lifts all boats. Humboldt will express interest and concern in American Indians. He will ask Jefferson about treaty negotiations. He will be appalled at the 1830 Indian Removal Act under Andrew Jackson. And he will send one of his proteges, Prince Maximilian Zuvide, to take the Swiss artist Karl Bodmer out west to retrace part of Lewis and Clark and come back with both natural history and Indian histories. And in fact, the vocabularies and the ethnographic data on all of the Indian tribes from St. Louis up into Mandan Indian Territory in what is now South Dakota forms one of the lasting historical accounts of this particular tribe. Similarly, Humboldt will meet George Catlin when Catlin brings his Indian gallery to Paris. And here you see Catlin drawing a picture of Humboldt being introduced to one of the Iowa Indians who performed for Catlin in Paris in 1845. The gesture of respect, making eye contact, eye to eye, meeting as equals is something that Humboldt wanted to convey to everybody. Humboldt stated, all races are in like degree designed for freedom. It was a mantra that he deeply believed in. And in 1804, when he's in the United States, Charles Wilson Peale will take him to Mount Vernon. Now, there's two reasons for this. First of all, George Washington had just died 5 years earlier, and Mount Vernon was very much a shrine to that first president. And Humboldt is certainly well aware of and impressed by Washington's farewell address, where he refused to become a monarch and in fact insisted on American democracy as a functioning rule. But instead of focusing on the portico and on the view across the Potomac River, which is the way we usually see George Washington portrayed at Mount Vernon, in this work, Eastman Johnson has focused on the slave quarters that attach to the back side, and every single person depicted in this painting is Black. That's important for our story because the people Humboldt really wanted to meet when he went to Mount Vernon were not George Washington's descendants. He wanted to meet William Lee. He wanted to meet the people who had been slaves under George Washington, to understand their lives, to be able to try to square the father of our country with the perpetuation of slavery under a Declaration of Independence that presumes that all men are created equal. It is a puzzle that Humboldt can't ever solve. It is the conundrum that drives him crazy about the United States. And in a not so subtle dig, when Humboldt got here, he wrote a letter to Secretary of State James Madison in which he said, I've seen the spectacle of the Andes in South America, and now I intend to enjoy the spectacle of a free people worthy of a great destiny. It's a little bit of a dig that, we could be doing better on that front. And at Mount Vernon, the words that Humboldt will write later come into clear focus, where he calls slavery possibly the greatest evil to have ever afflicted humanity. As early as 1825, Humboldt will write to a friend of his, Heinrich Berghaus, that if America can't solve this problem, it will probably cause a civil war that will be the end of the nation as we know it. Prescient words for 1825, certainly it all came true in 1861, and it seems to be an elegant frame for where we find ourselves today. Where race and exploration all come together is in the person of John C. Fremont, the explorer known as the Pathfinder, who was also very happy to be called the American Humboldt, who in the 1830s and 1840s will do 4 expeditions out west, nominally to find potential railroad routes in advance of the Transcontinental Railroad. But he will also take this opportunity to name everything that he can after Humboldt. And as a result, you see from one of his travel guides, the Humboldt River Valley, but there's also the Humboldt River Basin, the Humboldt Mountains. It's the reason we have a Humboldt County in California. In fact, everything that is named Humboldt in the United States is named for Alexander von Humboldt, and everything collaterally, including Humboldt cheese, owes its name back to Humboldt by a second degree of separation. Well, needless to say, naming everything after Humboldt caught the explorer's attention, and he was more than happy to integrate Fremont's findings into his own books, call him out and compliment him by name. And then when California, where Fremont is living, becomes a free state in 1850, against all odds, everyone thought it was going to come in as a slave state. Fremont becomes California's first senator, and Humboldt will write Fremont a letter in which he will congratulate him for the role that he played in ensuring that California represents freedom. That's really important, both for the depiction of Yosemite as an emblematic landscape of freedom, but also when John C. Fremont runs for president in 1856. He is the splinter from the Whig Party that becomes the Republican Party. He is the first Republican candidate. He is running on an abolitionist platform drawn straight from Humboldt's writings. And in fact, Humboldt's letter to Fremont will become part of the campaign literature in support of Fremont's bid for the presidency. The motto, as you see in this ambrotype, is Fremont and freedom. Humboldt endorses his candidacy and is crushed when he loses to James Buchanan. The letters fly fast and furious as Humboldt worries that we have lost our best hope at avoiding civil war. But Humboldt's words run through the campaign in the columns of Frederick Douglass's North Star newspaper, and Douglass himself plays an important role in the understanding of Humboldt's words on abolition in the African American community and among the New England abolitionists, because for about 28 years, Douglass has a romantic involvement with Adelie Assing, the woman you see here. She is a German journalist. She is the niece of Humboldt's best friend. She will orchestrate making sure that Frederick Douglass's autobiography is translated into German, and that when he goes on a book tour, that there are German sites on that tour. And so the two of them work together in order to send abolitionist material back to Germany, and also to make sure that the abolitionists in the United States are aware of Humboldt's writings. In 1856, the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society will name Humboldt their Man of the Year. This is a letter from William Lloyd Garrison, who owned the Liberator newspaper, asking Theodore Parker, his fellow Boston abolitionist, to speak on Humboldt's behalf, to make him the subject of an address at their 4th of July get-together. And Theodore Parker does this, and it is widely published and disseminated. 3 out of the 6 of John Brown's Secret Six supporters, including Garrison and Parker, are also devotees of Humboldt, infusing, I think, John Brown's rhetoric as he aims toward Harper's Ferry with the notion that abolition is at the core part of America's survival. Even up until the week that Humboldt dies, he is still meeting with American visitors, in this case to Berlin, calling himself half an American, but reminding them that the half that he is withholding has to do with the fact that I love your country and I hate your politics that still enslaves people. It is something he will never let go of. But as I said, he will never let us go either. Even after Humboldt's death, his words resonate. In 1864, at the New York Sanitary Fair to benefit the Union cause, New York businessman John Matthews will take a letter he has received from Humboldt, taking apart Daniel Webster for his support of the Fugitive Slave Act, and turn it into a carte de visite that is distributed for the benefit of sick and wounded soldiers in the U.S. armies. Matthews will send a copy of this to Abraham Lincoln with a letter saying, I know you are familiar with Humboldt's words. I am sure they bring you comfort at a time like this. So abolition was something that didn't just come through Humboldt and his letters to people like Fremont and the work of American abolitionists. It came from some of his most staunch friends who were also Thomas Jefferson's friends in Paris. On the left, you see Madame de Staël, one of the leading intellectual women of her generation. Her salon also drove Napoleon crazy, but attracted people like the Marquis de Lafayette here on the right-hand side, Simón Bolívar, and of course, Alexander von Humboldt, and a cast of Americans who traveled to Paris as well. The salons attracted liberal thinkers. They tended to be pro-US in their outlook and anti-monarchical for the same reasons. Helen Maria Williams, who is one of Humboldt's translators, also held a salon. And in fact, it's important to note that for women in Europe, as in America, the salon system allowed them to interact with and participate in scientific, political, and artistic discourse at the highest level. They simply invited all of the people from the lectures to arrive in their salons afterward and continue the conversation. It was their way of gaining access to the halls that they were denied membership to by dint of their sex. So the salon is a staging ground for involving women in finding their own voice, in becoming active and vocal participants in political, cultural, scientific, and artistic matters. This is, in fact, one of a painting of one of the European salons, again, giving you the sense that it is both men and women, it is art and science. It is an opportunity to break down or at least fray the edges of some of those gendered issues. So in the United States, since Thomas Jefferson had spent time as our ambassador to France, he brings that back with him. You see Dolly Madison on the right and Margaret Bayard Smith, the wife of Jefferson's favorite journalist, Samuel Harrison Smith, both of whom were encouraged to form salons in that cultural backwater of Washington, D.C., the Serbian bog on the Potomac River. And when Humboldt arrives in 1804, both of these women are in charge of hosting dinners, bringing together the luminaries in town in order for Humboldt to feel as though there is at least the embryonic beginnings of an American cultural awareness that will only grow and grow stronger as a result of their efforts. Humboldt had a specific influence on women as writers and thinkers. This is Susan Fenimore Cooper, James Fenimore Cooper's daughter. She met Humboldt in Paris, and with his encouragement, she becomes a natural history writer, including Rural Hours by a Lady. In fact, that is her book. Elmira Lincoln Phelps, Emma Willard's younger sister, wrote her familiar lectures on botany, which became a staple in K through 12 education for both men and women. There are, they think, over 300,000 copies of this were printed between 1829 and the 1860s. But I want you to notice the frontispiece here because it is based on Alexander von Humboldt's plant geography map. It is designed to begin to correlate altitude, climate, and the distribution of plants. And as a result, it is a Humboldtian primer on how botany can teach you about everything from climate to agriculture to cultivation. This is the plant geography map. The side columns are all of the statistical data that gets involved in that discussion. But it's also something that Emma Willard herself used when she created this isothermal chart of the climates drawn from Humboldt and others. And you'll notice that not only has she identified 10-degree separations in mean temperature from equatorial to the frozen regions, but all of the boxes in the middle identify the characteristic plants in each of those. Those of you who are gardeners know that we all still use the USDA zone chart in order to decide whether or if we can plant things and when it is safe to plant. This is like the version of that, drawn from Humboldt and then personalized and particularized to the United States. Humboldt deliberately made his lectures available to women. And I show you the building in which he delivered the lectures that became the book Cosmos. The poet Karl Holte in Germany went to one of those lectures where he described 800 people, standing room only, all there to hear the one speak. A third of them were women. It seemed important for Humboldt to recognize that smart people came in all packages, and it didn't really matter your gender, it didn't really matter the color of your skin or your geographical point of origin. What mattered was, are you curious? Are you literate? Are you interested? Are you willing to put the work into understanding the world around you? And that democratic, egalitarian perspective, the issue that the unity of nature includes the unity among all human beings, is baked into the institution in the United States that most closely resembles all of Humboldt's varied ideas, and that is the Smithsonian Institution. You see James Smithson on the left here and Alexander von Humboldt on the right. As it would turn out, maybe not too surprising after this lecture, Humboldt and Smithson knew each other. They had met in 1790 when Smithson was a young chemist in the Royal Society in London in Henry Cavendish's lab. And they met again in Paris in 1814 during Napoleon's last days, when Smithson spent close to a year in Paris with Humboldt and the entire French scientific community, having boozy dinners in the Bois de Boulogne, making fun of the British as they are losing the War of 1812. And one of Smithson's friends will make the comment, if I were a man of means, I would live anywhere in Europe except England, and I would invest my money in America. And invest in America is exactly what James Smithson did. In his will, he left his entire fortune to found an institution in Washington, D.C. for the increase and diffusion of knowledge among men, patterning it off of Humboldt's open-minded notion of learning being accessible to all, information being transmitted to all, and that collective enterprise being the rising tide that lifts all of the boats. At the core of Humboldt's desire for the increase and diffusion of knowledge is his desire for a well-educated and compassionate populace. From the outset, we are designed to absorb and reflect and refract his ideas. We stand for his commitment to universal equality. We stand for his ideas and his concerns for planetary stewardship. And we stand for his ceaseless pursuit of knowledge now more than ever. Thank you.
I'm just curious, was there any interaction between Humboldt and George Perkins Marsh, as far as you know?
As far as I know, they never met, but George Perkins Marsh clearly was steeped in Humboldt. And in fact, when he writes Nature and Man in 1864, I mean, that is clearly a Humboldtian enterprise. But even closer to Humboldt is Joseph Henry, the first secretary of the Smithsonian, is interested in using the grounds of the Smithsonian as an outdoor lab, if you will, and he hires George Perkins Marsh to come down and landscape the grounds so that it's an educational atmosphere as well. And the emphasis is on forestry, on tree types. Humboldt was very concerned about deforestation as human-induced climate change. In 1800, when he's in Venezuela, he's asked by the indigenous people at Lake Valencia why the lake level is dropping, and erosion means they can't irrigate their crops. And he consults with the village elders, and he comes back and he says, well, 20 years ago, you cut down all of your mature trees. You've changed your microclimate. You know, the trees are no longer storing carbon, the roots are no longer holding the soil in place. And so now you are subject to the kind of thing we're seeing in California with mudslides when the rains come, because there's nothing to hold the ground in place. And what's interesting to me is there's a thread of the issue of forests and deforestation all through Humboldt, that every German visitor to the United States, even Prince Max, will talk about how horrified they are that we are cutting down trees in order to create farmland and roads. And in fact, the APS early on will call trees one of America's natural monuments, and that what we need to do is, even if we cultivate the bottomlands, we need to leave stands of mature hardwoods as monuments on tops of all of the mountains. So there's no question George Perkins Marsh is deeply influenced by Humboldt. And I think he's also influenced again on the whole sort of connection between land management practices and the abolition of slavery. In the preface to Men and Nature, he talks about how the Roman Empire fell because of bad husbandry practices, because they overextended the empire and couldn't take care of it. And that the Confederacy, by doing monoculture in cotton and tobacco, is exhausting the land, and that will be their economic ruin.
I was going to ask a question about George Catlin, and you sort of answered it just as I thought about it, about whether their paths had ever crossed. And Catlin seems sort of unusual for his time in terms of his view and his interaction with the tribes. And
yeah,
he seemed to somewhat avoid the sort of noble savage archetype that some people indulged in at the time. What's your take on Humboldt and his view of the tribes of North America and South America, for that matter?
Sure. Humboldt almost always hired indigenous guides. He truly believed that indigenous people understood their relationship to the landscape better than their colonial overlords. And as a result, he looked to them to teach him. There was one part in his diary in South America where he is learning to determine which river he's in based on the taste of the water, but he admires the indigenous people who can taste the bark of a tree and tell you what kind it is. And it frustrates him because he can't do this. And so it's kind of like, wait a second, what do you mean I can't do this? But, he couldn't, not in the short time he was there. So he's very interested in indigenous civilizations. When he gets to Mexico City, he is quite literally the first European to come back to Europe and say, pre-Columbian civilizations are not primitive. You think that the Inca, the Maya, the Olmec, the Aztec, that they're barbaric. He said, no, he said, your attitudes toward them are barbaric. But he says about the calendar stone, any civilization that could chart its calendar using this elaborate device and understanding the heavens and the change in the seasons is hardly what I would call barbaric. When he gets to the United States, he's frustrated that he never meets indigenous people because there aren't any in Philadelphia and Washington, and he really doesn't get beyond that. And so when Prince Max comes over, one of the things Humboldt is hoping for is to fill in the gaps in his understanding of North American indigenous communities by being able to take Max's data and compare it to the data that he gathered in his 4 years in South America. Catlin's an odd duck. There's no question that in 1830, he is outraged by Andrew Jackson. In fact, in 1834, he will get himself kicked out of the White House for yelling at Andrew Jackson about his Indian policy. He will annoy Congress, which is why they will not buy his Indian gallery, because he shoots himself in the foot. He doesn't really understand diplomacy. He's too busy being angry. But Catlin also, although he wanted his Indian gallery to be an educational tool to teach European Americans respect for indigenous cultures and indigenous ways, he never thought that it would actually save them. He thought they were going to die out anyway. He does in 1832, and Rolf, this is really interesting. In 1832, Catlin comes up with an idea. Maybe we should set aside the western 2/3 of the United States as one big giant park and leave it to the Indians and the buffalo on which they depend and just leave them alone. Well, of course, that doesn't have any traction. But the point is, Catlin fears that Indian policy will mean the total destruction of these indigenous lifeways, and his job is to record it before it all disappears. That has earned him the title of cultural eulogist, which I think is fair. On the other hand, he's sincere in his desire for this to be an educational tool. The problem is, he's losing his shirt on this venture. He's not selling paintings. He's not raising money. And it's when he goes into business with P.T. Barnum that he ceases to look like an educator and he starts to look like an exploiter. And so in 1839, he can't really keep the Indian Gallery economically viable in the United States. So he ships everything to England. And then he ships everything to Paris. And it's in Paris where Barnum brings over a group of Iowa Indians that that Catlin had met in 1832 when he had spent time in their village. So he knows these people. They know him. They need money because they're in Paris, and he agrees to pay them, and they agree to dance. They dance for King Louis Philippe at the Tuileries. They then move the entourage to the Louvre, where Victor Hugo, George Sand, and the artist Eugene Delacroix all come to watch these performances. And then there is the performance where Humboldt shows up. And Humboldt, the director of the Louvre, Catlin, and the Iowa Indians tour the museum together. There's supposed to be a diary kept by one of the Iowa Indians who, and we do not know what has happened to it. I don't know whether it went back to North America with him when he returned home, whether it stayed in Paris, whether it's been destroyed, but please, 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 I really want it to show up. We have Catlin's account of this, but of course, Catlin is kind of a self-promoter, so I really would like someone else's perspective.
Yeah.
But it is interesting that as Catlin's reputation flags, he and Humboldt become friends. And it's a friendship that almost defies understanding, except that he's the guy who introduced Humboldt to the only United States American Indians that he will ever meet. And he's clearly grateful for that opportunity. So when Catlin comes to Berlin 10 years later, Humboldt makes sure there's a commission to have some of Catlin's paintings go into the royal collection there. He encourages Catlin to go to South America. He sends him a letter to deliver to his old friend Aimé Bonpland, who is still in South America. And so there's a real friendship there. And when Catlin writes up his memoirs of Europe, when he puts the line drawing opposite the title page showing Humboldt shaking hands with one of the Iowa, he also embosses it in gold leaf on the cover of his book, as if it is literally the Good Housekeeping seal of approval. And I sort of view that as, you may not like me, but this guy does, and he's my friend. So there is literally coattailing going on here in order to try to salvage his reputation. But Humboldt doesn't seem to mind. And in fact, he will enlist Prince Max to stand up for Catlin when Henry Schoolcroft goes after him, and the two of them kind of come to verbal and intellectual blows. So, when Humboldt decides you are a friend, he will defend you.
Did he go to any of the South American colonies where slavery was active?
Yes. In fact, one of the first things he witnesses in Venezuela as soon as he gets off the boat in Cumana is a slave auction, and he is horrified. He says they're treating them like cattle, they're checking out their muscles, they're looking at their teeth. He's beyond furious about the whole thing. And I think that crystallizes the issue of slavery for him. I think it had been a bit more abstract for him up until then. And to give you an idea of how deeply he feels about this, one of the things we need to remember is Humboldt arrives in the United States in May of 1804. April 1st, Jean-Jacques Dessalines declares Haiti a free Black republic. I mean, that's the reason that Napoleon has sold Louisiana to the United States is he is so sick of losing money in the Americas. He's had, the entire French army contingent he sent to Haiti starting in the 1790s to quell the slave revolts. They're dying from yellow fever. They're dying because the locals know the terrain better. And he's like, I'm done. I'm going home. And he abandons Haiti as a colony. And Humboldt is all over this. He's like, yes, they need freedom. This will prove that they are worthy of freedom, that they are able to do this. And of course, Jefferson is reacting in the opposite, which is, oh my God, this is going to foment slave revolts all over this country. The Richmond newspaper is talking about blood running in the streets, and it's only a matter of time before it comes here. There are hundreds of dog whistles in the American newspapers about slave revolts that starts with Haiti and will run all the way through Nat Turner. It just becomes everyone refers back to Haiti, like if it happens in Haiti, it could happen here. And here's Humboldt going, yes, this is a good thing. And we're all like, you are crazy. So yes, he's fervent in his belief of this. And he believes that although shedding blood is not optimal, sometimes it is necessary. And one has to remember Jefferson's comment about the Tree of Liberty needing to be watered with patriotic blood periodically. And I think Humboldt probably wonders why that doesn't carry over. But again, he doesn't want to outright jeopardize the friendship by taking Jefferson personally to task, but he is working through his proxies in order to put collateral pressure through Madame de Stael, through Lafayette, through William Thornton. He is pushing every button he can, but he doesn't want to push Jefferson directly because he really doesn't want to lose the friendship.
Mm-hmm. Eleanor, so how you talk about how he created lectures for women, and how did it change
your relationship with
the relationships for women?
It's interesting because women seem to be drawn to Humboldt. He is adorable. He is cute, but he has a Mona Lisa smile. He never stops talking. Everyone thought that he was charismatic and intellectual. And I mean, even Goethe calls him a fountain with many pipes. And Gallatin says he talks in a combination of French, German, Spanish, and English all at once. And I've learned more in 2 hours than I have in the last 2 years. So there is this sense that he can't wait to become your friend and tell you everything he knows. He also, I think, recognized that in Europe in particular, there's a certain admiration for the fact that here he is trying to figure out end arounds around Napoleon in order to get his work done and to stay in correspondence. And these women are doing an end around patriotic society, paternalistic society. They can't get into the scientific societies. They're restricted from the literary clubs. They're not allowed in a lot of the studios. So they bring it all into their living rooms, wine them and dine them, ask provocative questions, and revel in the fact that at least for a couple of hours every night, it's like they're there. And I think Humboldt recognizes the ingenuity required to do that and seems okay with that. As I mentioned, all three of his major translators, 4, are women. There's Helen Maria Williams, there's Elise Atte, who's a Danish scientist, Elizabeth Sabine, who is married to Edward Sabine, who's the leader of the Magnetic Crusade in 1837. These are all people who offer to translate Humboldt because it gives them immediate access to cutting edge ideas and an opportunity to translate it for the rest of the world. And so I think the fact that Humboldt's willing to do that, he's willing to work with them, he seems to enjoy working with them. And so there are all of these ways in which he's not a feminist in the sense that he's not out there in the street agitating for women's suffrage or for equal rights or for open memberships, but he is willing to undermine those societal norms in a way that brings him joy. It's like, we can get around this and we can have fun while we're doing it. And so as his politics become more radical, I think he is more and more open to that. And I think also, I can't help but think that after having conversations with mediocre minds of both genders, that when you find a thumping bright person, whether it's male or female, whether they're white or not, it's got to be just a really exhilarating experience for him. And if you're willing to learn from Indigenous people, if you are willing to push the limits of your own understanding, why on earth would you stop just because your society privileges relationships with men? That's the other piece of it. Women fall for him hard. It does not go the other way. Very strong circumstantial evidence that Humboldt is gay. He has very passionate literary conversations across the years in his letters with select peers and proteges. His brother Wilhelm, who is a diplomat in London, will write to his wife and say, Alex is coming, and he always has his favorite, and this time it's the astronomer Arago, and he says they can't be separated, but they can't be together under my roof. It would be unseemly. That is as close as we get to understanding that. But basically, consummated or not, Humboldt clearly pushed the edges of social norms, and particularly in Britain, which is very strict about those things. That was not a diplomatic issue that his brother Wilhelm was willing to confront. But I think that the passion that he felt for it, Humboldt said that he never got married, he never had kids, he never had a long-term relationship, because he said that there was so much work to be done that he just couldn't give in to, physical pleasures. So it was all about intellect and all about pushing his body. And I think that's one of the reasons for he sleeps 4 hours a night and calls coffee concentrated sunbeams. Every time his parrot saw the manservant bringing in the coffee service, he would scream in German, more coffee, more sugar. So it was clearly a functioning part of the Humboldt household.
Well, I wondered, you mentioned Carl Sagan, and were there others? Was there any influence by Jared Diamond from?
That's a really good question. It's been a while since I've read Guns, Germs, and Steel. So I'm going to bail on that particular one, but what I will say is this. One of the questions that I had to confront when I was working on this project was, given the fact that up until Andrea Wolf wrote her biography in 2015, if you had asked the man on the street anywhere in the United States, do you recognize the name Alexander von Humboldt? The vast majority would have said no. In fact, we did a survey 5 years ago in our courtyard at the museum, and we asked people, well, do you know Thomas Jefferson? Do you know Lewis and Clark? Do you know this? Do you know that? Have you ever heard of Humboldt? And we were at 7% on Humboldt. We were at 70% on Jefferson and Lewis and Clark, so that was good. So we knew we had a heavy lift there, but we also needed to account for why 90+% of the people did not recognize his name. Even Californians who live in Humboldt Central, Humboldt State University, didn't really know much about where the names came from. And in digging, it became clear that when Humboldt dies in 1859, we hold Humboldt celebrations every 10 years until 1909. The centennial of his birth is 1869. There's a 3-day conference in Boston run by Louis Agassiz and Ralph Waldo Emerson. Then there's another one in 1879, 89, 99, and 09. And then it stops. And it stops because of our involvement in World War I and World War II. And anti-German sentiment in general has a chilling effect on the teaching of German culture and German literature in the United States. Books come off of library shelves. Parents stop teaching their children German. Humboldt monuments are melted down and used for armaments. And so the lights kind of go out. And what happens then is that Humboldt's name gets disassociated from all of the things he was involved in. But as early as 1869, Louis Agassiz makes the point, every school child in America has been taught by Humboldt. He just doesn't know the name of his teacher. And what that said was, by then, all of the different sciences had been adopted by people who were building on Humboldt's work, doing really great things. And so those fields honor those people. Humboldt was sort of the last generalist. And as Roosevelt will grouse, we're all just training specialists now. So we have geologists, but they're not meteorologists, and they're certainly not botanists, and therefore they're not oceanographers, whereas Humboldt had to be a little bit of everything. And I think that increase and diffusion, if you will, means that we have to work hard to get back to the fact that those were Humboldt's ideas to start with. So Rachel Carson never mentions Humboldt in Silent Spring, but the idea of understanding why bald eagles are dying out, it's because their eggs aren't viable, because the shells are too fragile, because DDT is getting into their systems. When you're able to chart the variables on the table and say, what would happen if we pulled DDT out of the environment? And you find that eagles' eggs have tougher shells. They are viable. You hatch chicks, you have more eagles, and eventually eagles drop off of the endangered species list. So that notion of understanding downstream consequences, a lot like Lake Valencia and cutting down the trees, that's a Humboldtian legacy. And Rachel Carson owns that. It doesn't need to be, I belong to Humboldt by that time in order for it to be full currency. I do think that it's Carl Sagan who comes the closest to acknowledging Humboldt as the original mentor. Certainly cosmos is a term that was in circulation before Humboldt adopted it for his book, and it's been used widely since then. But Sagan knew who he was honoring. And Neil deGrasse Tyson has made it clear that he understands his place in that lineage as well. And so what I like to think is that as we've gone into eco-criticism, as we've moved forward on climate change and planetary stewardship, Humboldt is being reassociated with those ideas. He's been out there like a free radical in the universe, just circling in the atmosphere, permeating what we do. And now he's coming home to roost. And the nice thing is that in a conference like this, we can make clear how much his advocacy and his hopes for American democracy, as then as now, are still functionally a part of the decisions we make, the challenges that we face, and what kind of country we want going forward.